Good evening. Welcome to our POOIA Professional Organization of Iranian Americans monthly lecture series. Now I will just briefly introduce Dr. Lavonna Lovern. Dr. Lavonna Lovern joined the Valdosta State University faculty in 2003. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy and Master of Arts both in Philosophy from the University of Missouri and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Central Methodist College. She holds the membership in the American Academy of Religion, Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, National Congress of American Indians, Native American and Alaskan Native Professors Association, and American Philosophical Association. She previously taught at Central Methodist College and the University of Missouri. Prior to entering the field of higher education, she worked as a research consultant for Ultimate Potential Corporation, a nonprofit Native American foundation. Dr. Lovern, it's our honor to have you tonight, and on behalf of POOIA and Kanun, I actually thank you profusely for having accepted to talk for us. And tonight, Dr. Lovern is going to talk about philosophy and ethics. Dr. Lovern, we are all ears.
I first want to say thank you to all of you for having me come speak. I'm very honored, and to Barry, we've worked together for so long, and I've always respected his ideas and just been honored to work with him. So it's an amazing gift to be able to see you all and work with you. I do have a presentation, and at the end of it, I'm hoping that we can continue a conversation that I've long had. So I'm of mixed heritage. I have Native American heritage, but I also have some African American heritage and some that comes down from the witch trials, actually, and back to back to Scotland. So my background is varied. I also ended up becoming a foster child to a white family. It was a very nice white family, but it did cause some cultural differences. And I think that's the reason I probably got into a rather strange area of philosophy. It's not one that's done very often. So I study mainly epistemology, the study of knowledge, and how that relates to ontologies, the way of being in the world. But it's also married up with religious studies, because when I was my first teaching job asked me to also cross over and teach religious studies since I had a background. So a lot of what I do is a bit eclectic, a bit interdisciplinary. But I find that helps me get some pretty amazing information. So this is a project that I've been working on for, I've been teaching 40 years now at the universities. And so this is probably a 30-year-old project I've been working on. And I'm really hoping that you all can help me with that. So, okay, so one of the things about philosophy and ethics is that it just really is very broad in what we can do. And so there's a lot of discussion on ethics at many levels. So there's a representational level, which really gets at the traditional Kant, Mill, Aristotle, those kinds of people. And then there is more of the phenomenological. And that's an area of ethics that's relatively unrecognized still. But it asks the questions, what does it mean to actually live in the world and be in the world and exist with other beings and other humans, that kind of thing. And if there is an underlying notion or existence of energy that allows us to work at a deeper level than just representational models. So let me start with, I don't know how familiar everybody is with the basics of philosophy, but in case I accidentally fall into the jargon words, ontology, the study of being; epistemology, the study of knowledge; axiology, the study of ethics; logic is the study of reasoning and argumentation in the West. It's not that same thing around the world, but in the West. And most of my work is critiques of the Western ideology and knowledge systems. So metaphysics then puts all the above together. On this slide, we have differing systems, and people don't often understand that there are different logic systems. So there's a Western logic, which is a binary hierarchy. Things are either true or false, day or night, black or white. And then one side is the norm, and so it's at the top of the hierarchy, and everything else is below as the abnorm. And in that system, it sets up a way of doing ethics that's very limiting to people and very othering. Alternative logic systems, things can be both good or true and false, and both, or neither true nor false. So that sets up a different ethics. It sets up a different way of being in the world, and a different interaction with energy in the world, or spirit in the world, if that's what you want to call it. There's one question in the West. The West seems to think that there's a logical supervenience. So the idea is that at the very bottom, all logics converge into one single logic. And you know, ironically or not ironically, that has to be Western logic. And so there is this understanding that at the very basis foundation of knowledge, at our base knowledge functions, there is the same. It's all the same. And so that's why we can communicate, according to a lot of the philosophers in the West. But they don't account for the fact that when we go into language translations, certain things can't translate from one language to another. They can't even necessarily translate from one experience to another. So sometimes I can't explain traditional indigenous practices or ideas without sort of trying to translate them in my head to Western ideas so my students understand them. And even then, it doesn't work real well because I end up using Western terminology, which is not the correct terminology that should be used. So for those that I work with in epistemologies, we usually use the more indigenous tree idea, that everybody has a different root in the universe. And we may be able to communicate in the trunk of the tree, but we also flower into very different leaves and very different ways. So we have to admit that there are some things that other communities, people can know, but we never will. And that's very indigenous, globally indigenous, when we look at it, that you're not supposed to be having everyone's truths. Truths are different for different people, different communities. So the idea that there's one and only one truth is part of that Western logical binary. And that sets up this sort of othering, so that if you're not the one at the top of the pyramid, you're not normal, or you're not the one with knowledge. And so this binary has worked basically to establish most of the prejudices and discriminations in the West that we see, especially in academia. So because it's not even questioned, it's such a foundational area of knowledge, of Western knowledge, that it isn't questioned. It's just assumed that knowledge is a hierarchy. And a lot of that comes from the Western transition into the Enlightenment era, where there was one truth and only one truth for everyone, and we could find it through reason and knowledge. And so that discounts anything else. And they said it has to fit this logical system, or it's not considered knowledge. And so the Enlightenment, while it did good things, it also had a lot of real drawbacks for expanding knowledge. And that's where we get into what I've called the paradox of the binary. And so on the binary system, you basically have one group claiming truth and knowledge and all that, and everything else is going to fall below those standards. So they're going to set, this is what reality is, this is what truth is, this is our idea of evidence. And because all the other systems work on a different logic pattern and a different epistemology and ontology, they're not going to fit the dominant brand of knowledge. More than that, their evidence that they use in their systems will not be accepted in the dominant notion. And we see this in the West all the time. So if we go out there was a case where they wanted to build some observatories out on sacred land for some of the Apache. And they sent somebody from the Vatican out there, and he looked around and he said, well, there's no buildings, there's no temples, there's no anything to show that it's a sacred land, because they were looking for something that the West would call religion. But the Apache are not going to do those kinds of things. It's sort of like even with the Sami, they're indigenous to Northern Europe, and they will not mark their sacred areas. They know what they are, but they aren't going to mark them. And so the governments keep saying, well, obviously this isn't sacred land to you because you don't mark them the way we mark them. And that allows governments to take land, to claim that, we can use the resources there. And it damages the environment. So again, we're back to that ethical question of land and who gets to decide it. But the paradox of the binary sets it up to where unless you assimilate into the dominant group and the dominant view of knowledge, you're never going to be able to get up to the pinnacle. Equality won't be possible. You will always be othered. You will always be the lesser. And we find this in even our legislatures, our judicial systems, so that for Native Americans, we cannot in the United States enter oral history into it, because in America, they think of oral history as the game of telephone, where I say something to somebody and it gets passed around, and then eventually it comes out this gibberish. But in places that use oral history and oral testimony, it takes a lifetime to learn, and you have to recite things word for word and breath for breath. And so it's not something that indigenous people would say is changeable. And so Canada has begun to allow oral history and oral testimony from different indigenous groups, but the United States has not. So when indigenous people go into the courts and they present or try to present their side of the story, whether it's a land issue or sacred objects, that kind of thing, they are not able to introduce the paper copies that the government and the judiciary want. So they're lost. On the other hand, if they end up using some of that Western technology, mostly the paperwork, can you prove with birth certificates that your people were on this land for 100 years and never left. If you change that, you change your whole epistemology you're arguing for. So you're arguing for the rights of your knowledge base, your ontology, your existence. But you have to do it within the dominant fashion, which takes away everything that is unique and important or sacred for the indigenous. But again, that's part of that binary, because the West tends to split the sacred and the secular. And a lot of other people around the world, communities around the world, don't separate those. They're not binary. So things are both secular and sacred at the same time. And so that's going to change your ethical approach to reality. We won't have, these things are secular and these things are sacred. So we don't bring the sacred into the courts. And it gets into that whole, whether we're going to have religion and notions like the elections and things like that be separate. So separation of church and state. And we really find that this is a problem for many cultures when they enter the United States, or whether they've lived here like the indigenous have. Now, there are lots of ways to answer a paradox, but for Westerners coming out of Plato, Aristotle, and that group, they tend to view a paradox as a puzzle. We have to figure it out. We have to look at it and reason through it and get to the answer. Whereas when we look at paradoxes in other cultures, such as in Japan and other Asian groups, the truth is in the paradox itself. It's not there to be solved. It's not a puzzle. It's not a riddle. And so there is something there that can transport you to another level of knowledge inside the paradox. So again, literally the way we approach these things ethically is quite different. When we look at foundational assumptions, which is what the binary is, and what I do a lot in the linguistics that I work on, is finding out what are the foundational knowledge claims. Most of the time, the foundational knowledge claims are unprovable. At best, they're justifiable, but usually they're just assumptions. And so if your basis for your language and your logic, because we don't know which came first, logic or language, but they seem to be wrapped around each other. And so if your basis is this binary versus this, they're the same, or at least involved in each other, you're going to get very different systems of philosophy, existence, ethics. All of it's going to change. But historically in the West, we only recognize sort of this representational notion rather than the phenomenological notion. So if you've got a system that puts both the sacred and the secular together, the experience of ethics is much more phenomenological. It's experienced because it's part of everything you do. So you see many of these cultures who and religions that end up talking about right speech, right knowledge, right ways of being, right actions. And then you have some of the Western groups with like Mill, Kant, and Aristotle, they're going to form these metaphysical systems to represent what you should do in an ethical situation. So when we look at logic, paradox comes up a great deal because, of course, we have to talk about language, using language. The meta language is always a problem. And when we do meta logic, we're talking about logic using logic. And again, that ends up in these really weird paradoxical discussions that are hard to get out of. And part of that is the phenomenological experience of we can't really put into words what our experience in reality is. We usually tend to say things like, it's like this, or it's like that, or it's not like this. It's not like that. But pinning down exactly what that relationality is problematic. And we see that sort of notion in things like Buddhism, different groups of Buddhism. We see it in some Indic groups. We certainly see it in Aboriginal groups and in North, Central, and South American indigenous groups. But what we find is that these groups are perfectly comfortable living in the paradox. Whereas the West has this tendency to want to figure everything out. You know, if we find the notion for the Big Bang, the sort of equation for ultimate gravitation, then we've answered the question. We know how it all began. And so one is more experiential, and one tends to be much more representational. So we represent our experiences. That doesn't make one of them better than the other. It makes them sort of differently oriented. And oftentimes people then don't enter the same conversation when they're talking about ethics. So if we're talking about the death penalty or abortion or the welfare system, often people enter it with very different foundational assumptions. And so very different conversations are going on. They're not even defining their terms the same way. And so that sort of sets up this problem in the study of knowledge, is that we're looking at the same object from different eyes. And there was a scholar who wrote, last name was Wisdom, ironically, and he wrote in Philosophy of Religion. And he said, you know, he said that you have to think of it in terms of, in his case, he was talking about the existence or non-existence of God. But he says it's like two people coming to this one yard or garden, call it what you will, and one of them looks at it and says, look at all of the organization. There must be a gardener. Look at all the beautiful flowers. And so there must be a gardener here. And the other one looks in and says, look at all the weeds. Look at all the haphazard stuff going on in the garden. There can't be a gardener. Now, why one sees order and one sees chaos, that we can't explain. As of yet, that seems to be completely unexplainable. But by using the referential notions of ethics, we focus on reason, logic, argumentation, Western theories, empirical data that is justified by a certain type of evidence. Mostly we've moved to a mathematical and scientific way of organizing the world in the West. So we use formulas to describe phenomena, which is not to say that's bad. It is to say it takes us a step away from the existence. So instead of really talking about what it is to experience this or what the relationality is between two of us or between all of us, we talk about, is there a theory for ethics that we can follow so we know what is ethical and what is not ethical? Very legalistic type of language. In a phenomenological sense, when we're talking about the experience of reality, often people will use things like natural geometry, fractals, and they look at nature as recursive and self-referential. And so when you are a part of nature, phenomenologically, there is all this sort of self-referential data coming at you. You are part of and you're involved in, you create as well as destroy. And so the natural geometries show up a lot of times in what we call religion. And that makes it to where a lot of these groups take very seriously not only spirituality, but you could call it energy, because when you get down into studying like indigenous notions of spirituality, it really is like studying quantum mechanics, or energy transference is a lot of what you get in there. And so it's very intricate sciences and mathematics. And that's what many of them use to figure out the problems in their societies, to deal with each other, to build their buildings. It was this natural sort of geometrical patterns that for them came from the ultimate of the universe, whether that was spirit or energy or whatever. It was seen in all things, and it was personally experienced, so that there's a direct interaction between humans and the ultimate. Not all of them claimed it was divine, so they weren't necessarily religious in that respect. So we see it in Confucianism, and Confucianism is a philosophy and clearly not a religion. It's usually taught in religious studies classes, but it never was. Buddhism shouldn't really be taught under religious studies either. The Buddha himself would have been very upset about that, but it usually is. That's where we classify it. And again, it's because we make this very big distinction once the Enlightenment gets here between like science and religion, or philosophy and religion. And that sort of abstract way of separating things has consequences to how we experience each other and relate to each other and to the world around us. So a lot of times people will talk about indigenous groups having cyclical knowledge, and that's really too simplistic to talk about a cyclical way of being. Yes, they notice cycles, but most of these have more of a complex spider web of orientation, so that when they define themselves by their responsibilities, it's their responsibilities over many, many things, not just to their parents, but they have different responsibilities to their mother's clan and their father's clan, for example. And that's upheld in the kinship rights. And so when we look at the spider web, we see a lot of these communities not only building their towns around images of linking spider webs and geometries, natural geometries, but they also then do their knowledge that way, so that in many of them, you can't just go in a linear fashion with knowledge. You're going to have to backtrack at every point. And so in many of these cases, just to tell a single story is going to take hours and hours and hours, or days, because you have to tell every relating story to get the meaning. And then, since most of the languages are understood as metaphorical, they're going to learn, as you get older, you learn different levels to the story, so that eventually all I have to say is something like boy and snake, and you know all the different levels in your head. So your responsibility is to learn all these, not for me to teach. Very different world than I teach in every day at the university, where it's my responsibility to teach, not their responsibility to learn. And so it changes the dynamic as we change this, and we don't really recognize that, especially in the West, I think. So linguistic references, I put this in here because when I teach this at the university over the last 40 years, one of the things is that we don't see time the same way. And we can all say, yeah, we get that. But it's deeper than that. So if you're in Africa, you're going to, in some areas of Africa, you're going to look at time not in the future, because nothing exists in the future. So it's in the present and the past. And what that means is that the process of dying includes your body dying at one point, but your spirit or being or energy or whatever that is continuing. And so you actually have a life which has a future, but that life is totally in the past. And when I teach this, my students usually explode. because it is so difficult to think about how all that works together. And there's the short past and there's the long past. And in the long past is where all the community is. But the short past is your personal immortality. And then when we get into Aboriginal philosophy and Maori philosophy, we have an entirely different notion of time. And that includes them having always been on the islands, as opposed to the Western narrative, which says that they moved out of Africa and eventually got to Australia about 30,000 to 50,000 years ago. But according to the Australians and their evidence, and again, it's a matter of evidence, they've always been there, but they count time and place very differently, along with ancient forms of existence very differently in terms of kinship. And so that kinship notion comes back in again, the experience of, but we can see a lot of that when we talk about time is money, time flies, time rests, time runs, or the African, what time is it becoming? And there's an African proverb that one creates all the time one needs. And so we're in the West, if someone's sitting around, we say, well, they're just being lazy. They're not doing anything. They're not busy. In many places in Africa, they say, well, they are creating time. That's what they're doing. And it's a remarkable thing to think of it that way. So what we have here is sort of the difference between, and I know I'm skipping a lot of this, but we have the difference between the phenomenological, which seems to be the natural geometry when I talk to my fellow professors about what I'm doing, versus like Euclidean geometry, which is a representation of the natural. Now, most of the global indigenous groups have no problem saying Euclidean geometry is a representation of natural geometry, but that natural geometry is literally the experience of whatever that ultimate is that creates all things, because it's in all things. And so it's always there. So if we're looking at natural geometry and recursive geometry and that kind of stuff, we see it in the human skin, we see it in the human lungs. It shows up pretty much everywhere. And so I gave you some, I don't know, I like to look at pictures, I admit it. And so these are some examples of what has been classified as natural geometry, not sacred geometry, that's something different, but natural geometry, repeating patterns. And it's important to note that the repeating patterns in one area are not going to be the repeating patterns in another. So we're not saying that they all fall down to one. It is that different areas will use different repeating patterns in their architecture, in their languages, in their religious ceremonies, and in their philosophies. So that where we separate all these things in the West, they don't. They build them off of nature itself. So here's some representations of different religions that I threw together. And it's interesting how many of them are similar, but they're all very unique. And that's one of the problems when you start talking about global philosophies or global religions. And I don't like to separate them because in every religion, there is a great deal of philosophy. And in every philosophy, there's a great deal of religion. But as you look at them, you can see the patterns. And while each area is unique, because I put them in by threes, and again, a lot of phenomenological philosophers will tell you that it wasn't accidental, although I didn't intentionally put them in by threes. It just sort of happened. But threes, sixes, sevens tend to be numbers that we see. Fours come up a lot in different religions. And so there's some question amongst philosophers who do this work as to whether or not the number systems we actually deal with are part of this recursive pattern that we see. And of course, here are the ones I really don't understand. If you get me into the sciences, I'm lost. But these make sense to people, and they tell us what nature is. And I had to laugh because I found this one right here in the middle, which is actually a tree explaining a tree. So it's kind of ironic that this is a representation of a tree, but I could also show you a picture of a tree, or we could show you trees mostly fallen down right now, but we still have some standing. So in ethics, we have kind of different groups. I'm giving you two groups because I'm long-winded and we could go all night if I'm not careful. Representational ends up being rational, logical, argumentative theories. So we get virtue ethics from Aristotle. The only problem is most people don't read all of Aristotle. So it's about character and habit. But the problem is Aristotle doesn't hold everybody the same standard because some people are fighting for survival. And they are outside the realm of ethics because they don't have the time or the money. You have to have time and money to be ethical for Aristotle. For Kant, it's deontology, and this is very strict. So you get your maxim and you raise it up until you get to the categorical imperative, and that tells you exactly what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And Kant was very strict that all rational people would come to the same answer. Problem is, all you have to do is reword your original maxim, and you can make pretty much anything ethical. Utilitarianism, there's a lot of utilitarianism, including Rawls, but Mill is kind of the biggie. And in that, it's the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people with the least amount of pain, which sounds great, but how do we calculate that? And so we have people in utilitarianism that try to do it numerically. And it's like going to the doctor and they ask me, how much pain are you in between 1 and 10? And I always like that because I have no idea. It's 7.34. How much pain am I in? So how do we register someone's happiness or someone's sadness? It seems to be experiential, not mathematical. And so that causes trouble there. Kohlberg came along and followed cognitive development theory from Piaget and basically said that there are different levels of ethics and you will gain them as you go up, but women can only get to the relational level because they're malformed men. And that goes all the way back to Aristotle. And so he's like, women will always do ethics relationally between kinship and reciprocity and that kind of thing. And men will do it the right way, which is using these mathematical systems or these logical systems to figure it all out. Going with phenomenological, we do see that a lot of indigenous or women-oriented, female-oriented cultures and religions do relationality and reciprocity and kinship. And so Gilligan, who happened to be a student of Kohlberg, she came up with the ethic of care. But she said it wasn't that on this hierarchy, women were below. It was that women are assimilated in cultures differently. So they're taught from the time they're born to be the caretakers, the ones who fix the problems, the ones who make it all work. And so that's why they deal with relationality, as opposed to men in the West are not taught to be caregivers. And so they are much more apt to think of things in terms of legalistic ideas. So de Beauvoir, I always tell my student, she's famous because she slept with Sartre, but quite honestly, that wasn't really hard. A lot of people slept with Sartre. It's not a big deal. But she finished his existential ethics. They were partners their entire life. They're buried with each other. And he always contended she was a better philosopher than he was. She finished second to him in the Sorbonne, but she wrote The Ethics of Ambiguity. And that is a notion of ethics that takes freedoms and says, everything is ambiguous. We don't know what's absolutely true or absolutely false. So when we're making ethical decisions, we're having to go through this ambiguous notion. And the ethic of care, it says you have to take into consideration the situation. And a lot of people got upset with situational ethics because they thought it changed things. But for Gilligan and de Beauvoir, they were very much involved in every situation. Ethical situation is different. We don't have the same players, we don't have the same background, we don't have the same experiences. So how can we make a law that says this is the exact way you have to act? For Arendt, Hannah Arendt, she came out of course, Second World War, and as did de Beauvoir. But she put in there the notion of power, that too much of the Western ethics and philosophy and academia and society is all based in power, which we don't find in other cultures being the predominant factor to gain power. And we can even see it right now in the election. I'm not going to go into that, but you can begin to see how relationality versus power ethics or versus legalistic ethics does change the dynamics of the society and the situation. So, and I always throw in Marija Gimbutas because she got a bad shake as an academic. She was actually a philosopher and an archaeologist. And this was back, oh gosh, 30s, I think, 30s, 40s. And she was drummed out of archaeology because she took the stories, the narratives, the information, the science, the knowledge from the sites where she excavated and used that to sort of interpret her findings instead of just coming up with a Western interpretation and then applying that to what she found. She tried to go regionally and say, okay, these are the things that they believe. We still have their stories, their narratives, all of this knowledge. So the way they shape their pots, the way they did their understanding is going to be reflected in all their things. And so when we see in the West, the little figurines of the mother goddess, we only think of fertility. But in reality, if you start looking it up, Marija Gimbutas is saying, this is a much bigger thing. Yes, it was involving fertility, but it was a much broader science and system of ethics and systems of way of being in the world. And so I always include her because she got thrown out of a lot of the archaeology. And then about 20 years later, two men wrote basically the same thing in a book, and they shot to the top of the list. So it was purely a gender thing at that point. Now, Houston Smith, and I put him in here, we went to the same school, but not at the same time. And I got to know him, and he was just delightful. He was a philosopher like I was, trained in philosophy. And he too used philosophy and religion together to try and get at some of the deeper meanings. And so he looked at the culmination of human knowledge. And so he called them not religions, but wisdom traditions. So every culture has their wisdom traditions. There's something in that culture, in that knowledge base, that is important. And the way of being in the world is often described in religion, but in reality is in everything we do. So when he looked at this, he talked about the perennial wisdoms that came along. And the idea is that there's recurring signs and symbols found in various wisdom traditions. And he took this from what he studied of ancient Persia. And that's part of what got me interested in ancient Persia, especially the notion of good thought and ethics and how that plays out phenomenologically, but does not play out in terms of representationally. But he also had this notion, and I'm still exploring this, and I'd be happy for anybody's thoughts on this, going into the esoteric and the exoteric. So the esoteric he always equated with like the mystics, the Sufis, and the exoteric were then people like we might talk about the different denominations in the Protestants, in the Christians. And so the esoterics use the representational religions to go beyond and sort of see out the window to what's beyond the representation, while the exoterics stay within the actual knowledge base itself. Not that one's better than the other. They do different things and they have different places in reality. So that got me to thinking about representational or theory versus the sort of phenomenology of it all. And getting into, when we look at ethics, are we talking about this representational, this legal model, this hierarchical binary? Or are we talking about the experiential of kinship and relationality? And in that, I've gotten into, although I am not really that vested in science and geometry, but I try. Natural geometry has come in, and it has these patterns and these energies that we experience on a daily basis that we don't even notice. At the same time as I was working with Houston Smith, I was working with a student who wanted to do a paper for an Oxford conference on Zoroastrianism. And I said, sure. And she wanted to go back to the Star Child's stuff. And to do that, a lot of Christians will immediately think of the Jesus or the Christ figure, the historical Jesus or the Christ figure. But they're a much older, and this is what I'm hoping you guys will help me out a little bit, because I've tried to read as much as I can, but those Star Child references go back much farther in Persia than they do anywhere else. And I, of course, unfortunately don't speak the language, but I search all the time, and I've been doing this for like 30 years, trying to figure out where that fits in the sort of natural geometry of things, because there's all this reference to symbolism, and the language and the use of, again, good thought, bad thought. These are phenomenological experiences, not representational. So it's literally creating reality from what you think, from what you say, and what you do. And we find that in several religions, but interestingly enough, I think, as far as I can tell, and I am no expert in that way, it seems predominantly to come out of Persia. The term religion, like the term spirituality in the West, since the Enlightenment, has been used to advance science and mathematics. In other words, we're going to put religion and philosophy over there. And in the West right now, we're cutting all the humanities. So religion and philosophy are clearly not important at all. What's important is STEM, the science, and the mathematics. And they're very important to how we live. Engineering is very important to how we live. But to dismiss like the humanities tells us something about the culture, because suddenly these questions are not important at all. So we resign all the wise people or the religious leaders or the seer or the mystics, those people, we resign them to religion, and in the West, keep them out of everything. So we don't even talk about it. People in academia don't even like to admit that they might believe in something. With mystical experiences, that makes people nervous. And yet we find so many people in so many different cultures that talk about these experiential events that they can't put into language, even in meta language. They have to say it's like this, it's like that, it's not like this. So language can't encompass or express everything that we experience. And neither can the mathematical or scientific formulas. To continue the binary, the separation, continues this sacred and secular. We'll put philosophy and all that and religion over in the sacred, and then we'll do the secular, which is the real stuff, and find all this out. But we know that most cultures have healing arts, both psychologically and physically, spiritually, that work still to this day and don't have a lot of the synthetic after effects that Western medicine does. And we're coming to the end in Western medicine of things like our certain medicine lines, including antibiotics, and that's concerning for superbugs. But we do find things like chilies work really well. So if you go down and in operations, there are places where if you put certain chili remnants on, it takes all of the bacteria out. Honey can keep bacteria out of wounds. We find better sort of survival rates and faster healing in groups that use acupuncture in the East. And so it's interesting how all this knowledge that has existed is largely discounted in the West because it's superstitious or it's silly, and it's a way to keep people from reaching the top of the pyramid. And so we can continue to look at Africa as though they are savage and uncivilized, and yet without their constructs of the sacred binary, we wouldn't have a lot of what we do in our technology today. But we refuse to acknowledge that. And as long as we can keep them in the othered position or in the lesser position, we don't have to recognize their knowledge contribution to the world and to the world's wisdoms. So if we tell everybody these are myths or stories, then we discount them, because myths we claim don't have any truths, but myths have a great deal of truth in them. It's just not necessarily scientific. And most of the time, religious language is more metaphorical than it is scientific. So you can't go at it in a scientific way when you're looking at different religions. But as long as we keep them there and don't call them narratives or sciences, then we can keep them down on the hierarchy and make sure that the West becomes absolute. So the notions of the fractals are great because there was an 18th century scientist, I think it was Switzerland or Sweden, I can't remember right now, but came up with it in the 1800s, and it so upset him that he ended up in a mental institution for a while. And he got out, and everybody who did it, they relegated those to these, don't look at these, don't examine these theories. And it wasn't until 1974 that we actually get people going back to those theories. But when we look at African knowledge and ways of being, what we find is that for thousands of years, they had been using fractal images. Now in 74, fractals were only created through the computer. But if we go back to those images that I showed you early, many of them are fractals, and they exist in nature. And so many African buildings and monuments are built on fractal knowledge. And so many of the places we can't figure out how they did what they did it using their version or their form of a natural geometry. So, when we can't figure it out, we largely dismiss it. And it's sort of like coherence theory, where coherence theory works as long as everything's coherent. But you get too many pieces of the puzzle that don't fit, and eventually you've got to change your coherence theory. Whether that coherence theory maps onto the actual world, only foundationalists want that to happen. Other people are like, as long as my theory works. So current political and academic situations in the West, such as eliminating the humanities and the fields, eliminating all this knowledge and saying that the evidence of fractals in Africa is unimportant really does a disservice in the academics and to, I think, in my opinion, cultures itself, but certainly in the area of ethics, because it makes it sound like we don't have experiential ethical ideas. So I contend in my argument that religions, philosophies, spiritualities, they are representational of these phenomenological experiences. And those phenomenological experiences include things like natural geometry. You can call it energy, you can call it spirit. It doesn't matter what you call it. It seems to be there in all aspects of nature, including our bodies. So the idea that the moon can affect the tides of the ocean, but in no way affect humans, which are mostly liquid, is a kind of a silly idea. But I hear it all the time. You know, no, the moon and gravitation and that kind of stuff can't affect human beings. Well, that's because they're using astronomy and calling things that they don't like astrology and throwing it out. But there are ancient ideas of astronomy that do look at how humans are affected by all these things. And they're not going to tell you you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger or anything, going to get money tomorrow or anything like that. That's a Western perversion of what most of these scientific and mathematical theories are about. But it does suit the West to use them so that they can continue to belittle other cultures and other knowledge theories. And now you know I'm in trouble all the time. But in referring to these, it's really wrong-headed to put the representational models of ethics, knowledge, sciences ahead of the phenomenological, but we do it all the time in the West. So it doesn't even come up in the academy most of the time. Everything has to be very scientific and very, you know, without emotion, without sort of this relationality between humans. And yet in reality, we don't work that way. We work very emotionally between each other. So for the symbols, that's what we're looking at. Knowledge is neither binary nor hierarchical, nor should it be considered that way. So just because a knowledge system is other, it doesn't mean it's not better than what we have. And as long as we keep this binary hierarchy going in the West, we can't live in plurality. We have to live in hegemony, and that's unfortunate. This, by the way, is one of the fractals. I tried to pepper my slides with fractals, one, because they're gorgeous, but also because it really gets at what's in nature that we miss all the time. Responses to ethics tends to be exclusionary or inclusionary. And when we look at phenomenological ethics, they tend to be more inclusive. Whereas representational ethics tend to be more othering, and they tend to leave other people out. So the political ramifications, different eyes, same object. Wisdom traditions versus there's one right and true and only religion, which makes no sense. Especially if we're looking at it in terms of sacred geometries. If sacred geometries are going to be different throughout the world because some live by the ocean and some live in the desert, then religious expressions of the sacred geometry are going to be different because we don't live the same existence. We didn't used to live with hurricanes, and now evidently every October we will. So if we're excluding people rather than including people, it brings up sort of, again, this binary paradox. How can you be talking about ethics, even in a representational fashion, if you are excluding the other in the binary hierarchy? So that gets to the point where only people who act like this are ethical and everybody else is unethical. And that is the sort of prejudice and bias that the West has been suffering from, really since it embraced Aristotle. Not so much Plato, because Plato really was Pythagorean and got more information from the West. So Nelson Mandela had a statement I always like to tell my students. He said he never lost anything. He either won or he learned. And I always like to think that I either understand something or I learn. So I enjoy these types of sessions with everybody. And I really hope you have some good information for me so I can learn, because these are ideas that I have. They're ideas that I've taken to other people and they've worked out. But again, I'm stuck within my paradigm, my background, which is diverse, but at the same time, limited. So even when I read things of other cultures, and I really am fascinated by ancient cultures, trying to get at the beginning of human wisdom, primarily because in the West, we just cut it off. We don't even recognize that these ancient wisdoms exist. And yet we have all this documentation that goes ignored. And so I don't understand it, but it does get me in trouble quite a bit. I want to thank you all. If anybody needs me, you can always email me. I would love to hear from everybody. But I have one more slide that I want to show you, because this is something I'm fascinated with, the idea that early Zoroastrianism was like, we can date it back to about the 6th century BCE, which means from as I understand it, the language itself, it came from a much earlier Persian set of religions, or a religion or set of religions. So we're talking about even further back in history than that. But it was colonized largely by Christianity. And I find that Christianity really took a lot of the Persian ideas, including the star child, the eschatology, notion of saviors, heaven and hell, the Magi, the great mountain. And in these languages, which granted are translated into English because that's what I have at my disposal, there's something there, it seems to me, in this natural geometry that we're missing in other areas of the world, partly because this is one of, not the oldest religion only in the world, but it's also one of the longest lasting. I mean, if you're dating religions, a continuous religion, Christianity is only a couple thousand years old. It's relatively new. So if we go back to these really ancient religions, but especially one that continues to flourish, there has to be something there. And these ideas of complete energy, bountiful spirit or energy, destructive spirit, which is not necessarily evil. Now, the West is going to turn it into a good and evil dichotomy because that's what they do. But we see the notion that things are created and things are destroyed. That's nature. That's the way the geometry works. And so we get into good thought, good action, good works. I got good in there extra time, but these are my questions that I kind of have for you all. And you can ask me questions, of course, that's what you're supposed to do. But I have questions too, in that this creative, destructive, how it was interpreted and how it's still interpreted in Iran, in the areas of Persia in general, in ancient Persia. Could there be a phenomenological ethics in all that? I think there is. But again, I'm no expert. There also seems to be a science that goes with that. When I look at some of the symbolism of the Great Mountain and the discussion, there's a geometrical pattern there that's discussed that I think would be really interesting to sort of get into. But again, I have what little I can find, and there's not much that's translated so I can understand it. My other question is, if we go back this far, isn't it interesting that a lot of these ideas, of course, we know that Christianity colonized most of Zoroastrianism, because they're exactly the same. And I just go through it with my students and like, oh, but they want to be unique. They want their religion to be unique and unaffected and uninfluenced by anybody else in the world. And it's like, oh, I hate to tell you this, but if you look in the Middle East to Persia, all the way over even to what we now call Asia, these things are reoccurring themes. So there has to be something there, I would think, that would do it. But we know that the Vedas were largely influenced by Persian thought. And we can find the same stuff in the very early works there. So, you know, my questions for you all are kind of these three. What do you see as the most things, or can you point me to something that is a good read for all this that would help me out? Because it's sort of like getting Native American documents. You get a lot of people writing about it, but you don't want people to read most of those. You want them to read the stuff that's good scholarship, that is either written by or approved by Native American cultures. So that's kind of what I'm looking for from you all, or hoping to get. Again, thank you very much. I hope I didn't ramble too much. You ask a philosopher what their ideas are, and they could go on forever. You ask somebody who's a descendant of Native Americans, and we could talk for hours. So you put the two together, you're almost a lost cause. So, but thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and I look forward to talking with you.